The inheritance of kindness. When people in the city spoke about Margaret Holloway, they usually spoke about her fortune before anything else. They spoke about the mansion, the investments, the company shares, the luxury cars hidden inside private garages, the paintings that covered entire walls, the millions of dollars she controlled. Very few people spoke about the woman herself. At 78 years old, Margaret had become almost invisible despite her wealth. Newspapers occasionally mentioned her name. Business magazines still referred to her as the widow of Richard Holloway, the tobacco magnate who had built one of the largest cigarette companies in the country. But no article ever mentioned how lonely she was. No article ever described the silence that filled the mansion after sunset. No article ever talked about the fact that every evening she still glanced toward the chair where her husband used to sit. Richard had been dead for nearly 10 years. Yet some absences never truly leave. Margaret and Richard had met when they were young. Long before the money. Long before the factories. Long before private jets and expensive suits. Richard had been ambitious from the very beginning. He possessed the rare ability to convince people of almost anything. When he spoke about the future, others could see it too. Margaret had fallen in love with that confidence. She had believed in him when nobody else did. In the early years they struggled financially. Richard worked day and night building his tobacco business. Margaret supported him through every setback. Together they raised 3 children. Daniel, Rebecca, and Michael. As the company expanded, so did their wealth. By the time their children became adults, the Holloways possessed more money than they could ever spend. Yet success came with a cost. Richard smoked constantly. One cigarette after another. At breakfast. During meetings. After dinner. Before bed. Sometimes Margaret would watch him through the kitchen window, standing alone outside with smoke curling around him. She worried. Often. But he always laughed. "Something will kill me eventually," he would say. "I might as well enjoy life." Years later those words returned to haunt her. The diagnosis arrived shortly after Richard's 71st birthday. Lung cancer. Advanced. Aggressive. The doctors spoke carefully. The statistics were not encouraging. For the first time in decades Richard looked frightened. Not of dying. Of leaving unfinished things behind. The treatments were painful. Chemotherapy weakened him. Radiation exhausted him. The man who once controlled boardrooms filled with executives could barely climb a staircase. One night, while lying in a hospital bed, Richard looked at Margaret and whispered, "I built my life selling something that destroyed mine." Margaret held his hand. Neither of them knew what to say. Because there was nothing to say. The truth was sitting between them. Heavy and unavoidable. 18 months later Richard died. The funeral attracted politicians, business leaders, journalists, and investors. Hundreds attended. Thousands sent flowers. Yet when everyone left, only Margaret remained with the grief. Before his death Richard had updated his will. The decision shocked many people. Instead of dividing most of his fortune equally among the children, he left the majority of it to Margaret. The mansion belonged to her. The investment accounts belonged to her. Large portions of company stock belonged to her. Richard had explained his reasoning to the family before he died. "Your mother stood beside me through every stage of my life. Everything I built belongs to her first." At the time no one openly argued. But resentment has a way of growing quietly. Like weeds beneath beautiful flowers. Years passed. And resentment grew. Daniel, the oldest son, moved back into the mansion after a failed business venture. At first he claimed it would be temporary. Temporary became permanent. Rebecca returned after her divorce. She also insisted it was only for a short period. Years later she still occupied an entire wing of the estate. Both enjoyed the comforts of wealth. Neither paid rent. Neither worried about utility bills. Neither worried about property taxes. Their mother's fortune protected them from inconvenience. Yet despite living under the same roof, they rarely spent meaningful time with her. They appeared during holidays. Occasionally during birthdays. Whenever guests arrived. But ordinary days were different. Margaret often ate breakfast alone. Lunch alone. Dinner alone. The mansion was full of people yet somehow felt empty. Michael, the youngest child, lived hundreds of miles away. He had a family of his own and visited when possible. Unlike his siblings, he seemed genuinely concerned about his mother. But distance limited what he could do. The responsibility of daily care remained absent. And as Margaret's health slowly declined, that absence became impossible to ignore. At 79, Margaret suffered a fall while walking down a staircase. Fortunately nothing broke. But the incident frightened her doctor. After several evaluations, he made a recommendation. "You need someone with you." Margaret sighed. "My children live here." The doctor hesitated. Then carefully replied. "I know." That single sentence said everything. A month later she hired a full-time caregiver. Her name was Anna Morales. She was 32 years old. The daughter of immigrants. Hard-working. Soft-spoken. Exceptionally attentive. Margaret expected competence. Nothing more. Instead she found something she had not experienced in years. Genuine care. Anna arrived every morning before sunrise. She organized medications. Prepared meals. Managed appointments. Helped around the house. But what truly distinguished her was not her work. It was her attitude. She never acted as though Margaret was a burden. She never looked impatient when stories repeated. She never glanced at her phone during conversations. She listened. Really listened. And for someone as lonely as Margaret, that mattered more than anyone realized. One afternoon Margaret spent nearly an hour describing a vacation she and Richard had taken 40 years earlier. When she finished, Anna smiled. "It sounds beautiful." Margaret laughed. "I've probably told you that story 10 times. 12. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You counted?" "I like that story." The old woman laughed harder than she had in months. As time passed, a friendship developed. Then something deeper. Not romantic. Not dependent. Familial. The kind of bond that forms when two people consistently show up for each other. Anna celebrated birthdays with her. Watched old movies with her. Walked through the gardens beside her. Sometimes they sat for hours drinking tea and discussing life. Margaret learned about Anna's childhood. Her struggles. Her dreams. Anna learned about Richard. The children. The early years of the company. The sacrifices hidden behind wealth. For the first time in many years, Margaret felt seen. Not as a widow. Not as a fortune. Not as an obligation. As a person. The contrast with her own children became increasingly painful. Daniel often disappeared for days without explanation. Rebecca spent much of her time attending social events. Both seemed far more interested in preserving their future inheritance than improving their relationship with their mother. One evening Margaret sat alone in the library waiting for dinner. Nobody came. Hours passed. Eventually Anna found her there. "You haven't eaten." Margaret forced a smile. "I wasn't hungry." Anna glanced at the untouched tray nearby. Both knew it was a lie. Without saying a word, Anna sat beside her. The two women shared a simple meal together. For reasons Margaret could not explain, that dinner remained one of her happiest memories. Several months later everything changed. Margaret accidentally overheard a conversation. Daniel and Rebecca were speaking in the library. Their voices carried through the hallway. "How much longer do you think this will go on?" Daniel asked. Rebecca shrugged. "Who knows? Mom controls everything. Not forever." Then came laughter. A casual, careless laugh. The kind people use when discussing something that does not hurt them. Margaret stood frozen. "At least the estate will finally be divided afterward," Rebecca said. Daniel replied. "If that caregiver doesn't somehow talk Mom into giving her something." More laughter. Margaret quietly walked away before they saw her. But the words followed her. 4 days. 4 weeks. 4 months. That night she could not sleep. She sat beside her bedroom window watching rain strike the glass. Eventually she opened an old photo album. There were pictures of birthday parties, family vacations, Christmas mornings, school graduations. She stared at the faces smiling back at her. When had everything become so distant? When had love become expectation? When had gratitude disappeared? She had spent decades sacrificing for her children. Yet the person offering her the most kindness was not family by blood. It was Anna. A woman with no obligation to care. A woman who chose to care anyway. A few weeks later Margaret contacted her attorney. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Documents were reviewed. Changes were made. Instructions were clarified. When the lawyer finally left, Margaret experienced a feeling she had not felt in years. Peace. Not because she wished to punish anyone. Because she wanted her final decisions to reflect her true values. The next 2 years passed quietly. Margaret's health continued to weaken. Anna remained beside her. The younger woman never asked questions about finances. Never mentioned inheritance. Never hinted at future rewards. She simply continued caring. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. Exactly as she always had. That mattered enormously to Margaret. Because kindness given without expectation is rare. One spring afternoon they sat beneath blooming cherry trees in the garden. Pink petals drifted through the air. The world seemed peaceful. Margaret turned toward Anna. "You know," she said softly, "I sometimes wish you had come into my life earlier." Anna smiled. "You had a full life before me." "Yes." Margaret looked toward the sky. "But it would have been nice to have another daughter." Anna's eyes filled with tears. For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Anna gently squeezed her hand. The gesture contained more affection than many conversations. A year later Margaret passed away peacefully during the night. She was 82 years old. The city mourned. Newspapers published lengthy articles. Business leaders praised Richard's legacy. Friends remembered Margaret's generosity. The funeral was beautiful. Yet the most emotional person present was not one of her children. It was Anna. Because she had not simply lost a client. She had lost family. Several days later the will was read. Daniel arrived confident. Rebecca arrived confident. Both expected substantial inheritances. And they received them. Large ones. Far larger than most people would ever see. But then came the final section. The attorney announced the creation of a trust fund for Anna. A significant one. Enough to ensure financial security for the rest of her life. Shock filled the room. Daniel looked furious. Rebecca looked stunned. Michael quietly lowered his head. He understood. Perhaps better than anyone. Then the attorney opened a final letter written by Margaret herself. He began reading. "My children were blessed throughout their lives with opportunities, education,